Every empire that ever tried to erase China ended up becoming Chinese. The Mongols, one of the most brutal military machines in human history. They swept through China like a hurricane, conquered it completely. Then something strange happened. They started wearing silk robes, sitting on dragon thrones, running a Chinese-style government. The Manchus did the exact same thing. So did every nomadic group before them. They arrived as conquerors. They left as Chinese. This is how it happened, and why it kept happening for over 2,000 years. For most of its history, China's biggest problem wasn't internal rebellion or civil war. It was the people living just north of them, on the Eurasian steppe. That's where the nomads lived. Around 800 BC, something revolutionary happened on that steppe. The nomads figured out cavalry warfare. Riding horses at full speed, shooting compound bows, while galloping, arrows that could punch through armor from 100 meters away. Suddenly, these people became extremely dangerous. Chinese armies were bigger, more organized, better equipped. But the nomads were faster, way faster. They could raid a Chinese border town, take everything valuable, and vanish back into the grasslands before any army could respond. That's why China built the Great Wall. It's basically the world's longest "please stop coming in" sign. A historian named Thomas Barfield spent years studying this exact relationship. His book, The Perilous Frontier, breaks down something surprising. The nomads and China weren't just enemies. They were actually connected, symbiotic, even. Barfield saw steppe empires and the Chinese state as linked like two sides of the same coin. Nomadic leaders could only hold their own people together by extracting resources from China. Tribute, silk, gold. The nomads needed China, and China needed the nomads to stay calm on its northern border. It was a weird, messy relationship, but it worked until it did in single quotes. That sometimes the relationship broke down completely. Sometimes a nomadic group stopped asking for tribute and decided, we're just going to take the whole thing, and a few of them actually succeeded. The Mongols are the most famous example. In the 1200 segundos, Genghis Khan built the largest land empire the world has ever seen. And yes, he conquered China. His grandson, Kublai Khan, established the Yuan Dynasty and sat on the dragon throne, the ultimate seat of power in China. A Mongol ruled in China. Now imagine being a Mongol warrior who'd spent your entire life on horseback, eating dried meat under open sky. China must have looked like another planet. Hundreds of millions of people. Massive cities. A government system so complex it took decades to understand. Thousands of years of written history. It's like someone from a village of 200 people suddenly becoming mayor of New York. So what did the Mongols do? They adapted. They had to. You can't run a country that size on military fear alone. You need tax collectors, court officials, people who know how to keep records, manage grain supplies, settle legal disputes. You need a system. And China already had one. It had been running smoothly for centuries. The Mongols conquered China and found themselves running it, using existing Chinese frameworks. The state apparatus was already there, and it was far more powerful than anything the steppe had ever built. So they started using it. They kept Chinese administrative models. They employed Chinese scholars called the literati to help govern. They collected taxes the Chinese way. They held court the Chinese way. They even started dressing partly in Chinese style. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. If you want to see this process at its most complete, look at the Manchus. The Manchus came from the northeast, a region called Manchuria, near modern Russia and Korea. They were not Chinese. They had their own language, their own traditions, their own identity, as a warrior people. In 1644, they marched through China already, collapsing from internal chaos, and they took over. They called their new empire the Qing Dynasty. Here's the fascinating part. The Manchus were smarter about this than the Mongols. They didn't try to smash Chinese culture and replace it with their own. Instead, they did something much cleverer. They put on the costume. They adopted Confucian ideology, the philosophy that had been the backbone of Chinese government for nearly 2,000 years. They performed the same imperial rituals Chinese emperors had been doing since ancient times. They kept the civil service exams, the competitive tests that determine who got government jobs. They maintained the same court structure, same titles, same ceremonies. Confucianism, by the way, isn't just a religion or philosophy. It's an operating system for running a society. It tells everyone where they stand. Emperor at the top, then officials, then farmers, then merchants. It defines how you speak to superiors, how you honor ancestors, how you run government. It's baked into everything how people think. Raise their children, speak to their bosses. Torul China, you had to speak that language. Not just Chinese, the spoken language, but the entire cultural and political system behind it. And the Manchus did exactly that. They became fluent in Confucianism. They performed it better than many Chinese rulers had. Over time, the line between Manchu and Chinese became harder and harder to see at least in how they ran the country. So, this happened with the Mongols, happened with various other nomadic groups who conquered parts of northern China. Why? What is it about China that kept pulling outsiders in and transforming them? 3 big reasons. First, the system was too big to ignore. China's government wasn't some small operation. By the time the Mongols arrived, it had been developing for over 1,000 years. Tax, systems, courts, methods for managing millions of farmers and hundreds of cities. Officials who ran this machine had spent their entire lives learning how to operate it. You couldn't just throw that out and start over. Nobody had a better alternative if you wanted to actually govern China, not just raid it, but run it. You had to work with what was already there. You had to use their people. And when you use their people, you slowly become like their people. Second, being Chinese wasn't about blood. This surprises most people, that in many cultures throughout history, identity is about ancestry, your ethnicity, your bloodline. But in China, the concept of Zhonghua, which roughly translates to Chinese civilization, was always more about participation than ancestry. If you followed Confucian ethics, used the writing system, respected the hierarchy, honored rulers and ancestors the proper way, you were part of the civilization. Didn't matter if your grandparents rode horses on the steppe. If you lived by these principles, you were in. This is huge. It meant the door was always open. Conquerors could walk through it. They just had to adopt the system. Historian Hanne Burbank, in her book Empires in World History, points out that different empires handled diversity very differently. Some, like Rome or later European colonial empires, maintained clear distinctions between center and periphery. China worked differently. It pulled territories and peoples inward, standardizing them, integrating them, absorbing them. Third, the numbers were overwhelming. Here's a simple fact, often overlooked. The Mongol army that conquered China was formidable. Maybe a few 100,000 warriors at peak. China had somewhere between 60 and 100 million people. The Manchus who took over in 1644 numbered maybe 1 to 2 million people. China had something like 150 million. You're a conquering group of 2 million. Now, surrounded by 150 million people who all share a common language, culture, rituals, beliefs. You need those people to grow food, pay taxes, build things, run the economy. Every single day, you're surrounded by this ocean of culture. You hire their officials, live in their cities, eat their food, hear their language everywhere. The practical reality: you either adapt or lose control, and adapting means becoming more like them every single generation, until eventually the difference disappears. Let's be honest about something. This story isn't purely a feel-good tale of cultural harmony. The Mongols didn't absorb Chinese culture peacefully. The conquest itself was devastating. The Mongol invasion of northern China in the 1200s killed millions. There was a real ethnic hierarchy in the Yuan Dynasty. The Manchus also enforced some brutal policies. The most famous, the Qing order. They forced Han Chinese men to shave the front of their heads and wear their hair in Manchu style on pain of death. This was deeply offensive to Han Chinese people, for whom cutting hair was considered disrespectful to the body given by your ancestors. So yes, absorption happened. But it wasn't always gentle or voluntary. The interesting thing, even with all that tension and coercion, the structural pull of Chinese civilization was still strong, enough to eventually bring conquerors into its orbit. The Manchus enforced their hair rules, but they also bowed to Confucius. They maintained ethnic distinctions, but they governed through Chinese institutions. Peter Perdue, in his book China Marched West, shows how this played out along China's frontiers over centuries. Wherever the frontier moved, the same pattern emerged: assimilation through administration, absorption through structure. This is the really striking thing when you look at the full picture. Most great civilizations in history have been conquered and replaced. The Roman Empire falls. Empire falls. Rome eventually disappears, replaced by different kingdoms. The empires of Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria get swallowed up and vanish. New civilizations override old ones. China is different. China got conquered multiple times, and it kept re-emerging. Not because it had invincible armies, not because its walls held, but because its culture was so deep, so structured, so comprehensive that it kept pulling conquerors in. Think of it like a powerful river. You can jump in and swim against the current for a while, but if you stay in long enough, the current takes you where it's going. That's what Chinese civilization did to its conquerors. The current was the language, the bureaucracy, Confucian thought and ritual, the civil service exam, the way you bowed to the emperor, honored your ancestors, ran your local government. Once you are in that river, it's very hard not to go where it's flowing. Timothy Brook, in The Confusions of Pleasure, gives a ground-level look at what Chinese society felt like during this period. The daily life, the economy, the culture foreigners were walking into when they entered China. What you see is how total that cultural world was. It wasn't just laws and government. It was food, music, art, festivals, the way you dressed, the way you spoke to your parents. It was everything. That's what conquerors were absorbing. Not just a government, a whole world. You don't have to go back to the Mongols to see this logic at work. Modern China still operates on a version of this same framework. The emphasis on national unity, on civilizational continuity, on the idea that being Chinese is about participating in a shared culture and political order. That's the same thread running back through history. Whether you agree with how that plays out in contemporary politics or not, the internal logic is consistent. It didn't start in the 20th century. It's been the operating principle of Chinese civilization for more than 2,000 years. China didn't survive by defeating its enemies. It survived by digesting them. If this story changed how you see empire and cultural power, hit that like button and subscribe to Axie's Lens for more stories that reveal how civilizations actually work. Next one's ready. Don't miss it. Don't miss it.